Most people think losing control happens slowly, one forgotten appointment or misplaced bill at a time. Mine happened in a single afternoon. One moment I was living my normal life, paying my own bills and cooking my own meals. The next, I discovered my children had filed papers claiming I couldn't think for myself anymore. They tried to take my house, my bank accounts, and every decision I had left. And they did it while pretending they were protecting me. I have two children, my daughter, Emma, and my son, Daniel. When they were growing up, I tried to give them everything I could: time, attention, stability, a warm home. Their father passed away when they were both still young, and I spent years juggling two jobs, barely sleeping, doing everything in my power to make their childhoods feel as safe as possible. I never imagined that decades later, those same children would be the ones making me feel unsafe in my own life. For most of my 70s, things were smooth and predictable. I had my routines, my neighbours, my garden that always needed more weeding than I had the patience for. I stayed active because I wanted to, not because anyone made me, and I was proud of how well I was doing. People in my age group often talked about memory issues, confusion, forgetfulness. I didn't have any of that. If anything, I was sharper than ever, because I paid attention to details. I had learned to be cautious as I got older. The trouble started with something small. I slipped on a rug near the back door while carrying laundry and twisted my ankle badly enough that I needed help getting around for a few days. It wasn't a major injury, but it was enough to slow me down. Emma insisted on visiting. Then Daniel came the following weekend. At first, I thought they were simply worried, but the way they hovered around me sent tiny waves of discomfort through my stomach. They cleaned out my pantry, rearranged my drawers, and wrote lists of things I supposedly needed to remember. It felt like they were preparing for something I wasn't aware of. My ankle healed quickly, and I went back to my normal life. But they didn't stop checking on me. The calls became frequent, the questions became invasive, and I felt judged for things I had been doing perfectly fine for years. When I mentioned I had forgotten to buy milk one afternoon, Emma responded with a tone that made me feel like a child. When I admitted I paid a utility bill a day late, Daniel reminded me how easy it is to make mistakes at my age. I began noticing a shift in the way they looked at me, like they weren't seeing their mother anymore, but someone fragile, incompetent, someone they believed needed supervision. I brushed off the feeling. Children worry when their parents age, I told myself. It was natural. And besides, I had only slipped on a rug. Anyone could slip. Deep down, though, a sense of unease began to grow, settling in the quiet places of my mind where doubt likes to hide. Weeks passed. My life carried on as usual, but the interruptions from my children increased. Emma showed up unannounced one morning with grocery bags I never asked for. Daniel brought folders from his office, talking about important things adults should plan ahead for. I tried to wave it all off, but they continued circling around me like two hawks, waiting for something to happen. Then, one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. I had just come home from my routine medical checkup when I noticed an unfamiliar envelope wedged into my mailbox. Thick paper. Government seal. Legal formatting. At first I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps something meant for a neighbour. But when I opened it, my legs weakened beneath me. Inside were documents related to a petition for legal guardianship. My name was listed as the person in question. My children's names were listed as the petitioners. According to the paperwork, they had filed a request claiming I was no longer capable of making decisions for myself. They wrote that I was confused, forgetful, unable to manage my finances or my daily life. They claimed I was at risk of harming myself through neglect. None of it was true. Not a single word. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the papers shaking in my hands. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. It felt as though someone had reached inside me and pulled the air out of my lungs. My own children, my babies, the ones I had raised alone through hardships I never let them see, believed I shouldn't be in control of my own life. Or maybe they didn't believe it at all. Maybe they just wanted control. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely afraid. Not of falling, not of illness, not of aging, but of what people I loved might be capable of doing behind my back. I walked through my quiet house, looking at the walls I had painted myself, the shelves I had built, the photos of birthdays and holidays. Everything suddenly felt fragile, like the life I had built could be taken from me with a few signatures. I folded the papers slowly, carefully, as if handling something dangerous. They felt heavy in my hands, heavier than anything I had carried in my life. And as I looked out my kitchen window at the yard I had tended for decades, a painful truth settled inside me. My children weren't trying to help me. They were trying to take my autonomy away, and I had no idea how far they were willing to go. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the legal papers sitting on my kitchen table, staring back at me like they were alive. I kept rereading the same sentences written by people who shared my blood, claiming I was confused, disoriented, unable to care for myself. The more I read, the more my chest tightened with a mix of fear and disbelief. I had heard stories about guardianship cases on the news, stories where elderly people lost their homes, their savings, their entire independence because someone else decided they were incapable. I never imagined my own story would become one of them. The next morning, I forced myself to follow my usual routine. I watered my plants, fed the stray cat that visited my porch, brewed a cup of tea, anything to convince myself my life wasn't spiraling out of my hands. Each small action felt like proof that I was capable. But every time I moved, the petition sat in the back of my mind, whispering that my life might no longer belong to me. Hours later, Emma called. She didn't mention the papers. She asked about my ankle, my doctor's visit, whether I was eating well. Her voice sounded warm and casual, but underneath it I sensed something rehearsed, something prepared. I responded politely, but my heart raced with panic. How long had she been planning this? Had the decision already been made in her mind? Did she think I would simply accept losing control over everything I had worked for? When Daniel called that evening, the tone was similar. Too careful, too measured. It was as if they expected me to confront them, and their overly calm voices were shields against that possibility. I ended both calls quickly, not trusting myself to speak without my voice cracking. For a week, I told no one about the petition. I felt ashamed, though I didn't know why. I kept asking myself whether I had done something to make them think I needed this. Maybe I had talked too much about being tired. Maybe I mentioned forgetting something once or twice. Maybe that one fall made them think I was falling apart. But no matter how I turned it in my mind, nothing justified stripping someone of their independence behind their back. The breaking point came the following Monday. I returned from grocery shopping to find Emma's car in my driveway. She didn't usually come on weekdays, and for a moment, I simply stood frozen behind the wheel, watching her through the windshield as she walked around my yard with her arms crossed. A strange heaviness settled in my stomach. She wasn't there for a visit. She was there for a purpose. I stepped inside the house and found she had let herself in with the spare key I had given her years earlier. She had reorganized my mail into labeled piles, thrown out a stack of old magazines, and placed a detailed schedule on my counter with reminders about medication, meals, and appointments. Everything about it felt wrong, constricting, like she was mapping out a life she intended to manage. She inspected my refrigerator, my pantry, my laundry room, places she hadn't cared about in years. She commented on what she believed I had forgotten to do, what she thought looked concerning, what she assumed I couldn't keep up with anymore. I watched her move around my home as though it already belonged to her, as though I had become a temporary guest in my own space. Later that same day, Daniel showed up. He carried a briefcase and a stack of printed documents. He spoke to me with the same tone people use when explaining something to a child. He laid out papers indicating medical directives, financial oversight plans, and suggestions for future care options. The language was vague but alarming. He talked about reducing my responsibilities and making things easier for me. My hands trembled as I listened, not from weakness, but from a rising wave of anger and fear. As they spoke about my life as if I wasn't standing there, I finally understood something I had been trying to deny. They weren't doing this because they thought I needed help. They were doing it because taking control of my life made their lives easier. Fewer responsibilities for them, fewer worries, more access to decisions I had always made on my own. And perhaps, beneath it all, a belief that they deserved to have control over my home, my accounts, my future. That evening, after they both left with satisfied expressions and promises to return soon, I sat alone in my silent living room. The house felt different, smaller, like it had already begun slipping away from me. I looked around at the furniture I had chosen myself, the photographs lining the mantel, the soft lamp that had belonged to my mother. Everything around me was a piece of a life I had built carefully over decades. The idea of losing any of it made my chest tighten. The next morning, I gathered all the documents: the guardianship petition, Daniel's forms, the schedule Emma had taped to my refrigerator, and spread them across my dining table. I examined each page, reading every claim, every accusation, every assumption they had made about me. Some statements were exaggerated, others were complete lies. One sentence in particular made my hands shake. They had claimed I often forgot where I was and needed reminders to perform basic tasks. That had never happened. Not once. To see it written as fact felt like an act of violence. My fear slowly turned into determination. If they wanted to take control of my life, I needed to fight to keep it. Without telling my children, I contacted an elder law attorney in the nearby town. It took every ounce of courage I had to dial the number. The receptionist scheduled an appointment for later that week. Those next few days felt like walking across a frozen lake, every step slow and careful, hoping the surface didn't crack beneath me. When I arrived at the attorney's office, I felt exposed, vulnerable, uncertain of how to even explain the situation. But as I described the events, the fall, the visits, the rearranged drawers, the invasion of my home, the guardianship papers, I saw understanding in the attorney's eyes. She had seen this before, more times than I could imagine, and that realization eased something inside me. She explained that guardianship wasn't a simple process. My children would need to prove incapacity. They would face questions, examinations, and scrutiny, and I had every right to defend myself. She suggested a full medical evaluation to confirm my mental capacity, recommended gathering written statements from neighbors and community members who had interacted with me, and offered to file an objection to halt the process until a full hearing could be held. For the first time since the petition arrived, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't alone. And my life wasn't theirs to take. The days following my meeting with the attorney felt different. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted into something sharper, something with edges. I realized I had been too trusting, too willing to assume the best of people simply because they were family. Now I understood that protecting myself meant questioning everything and everyone, even the people I once believed would never harm me. My attorney arranged a full cognitive evaluation at a local clinic. I walked in with my shoulders squared, determined to prove that I wasn't the confused, incompetent woman described in the petition. The tests were long and tiring, but each question felt like a small act of reclaiming my identity. I answered clearly, confidently, knowing that every correct response built a wall between me and the future my children were trying to trap me in. When the results came back, they stated plainly and professionally that I was mentally sound, with no signs of cognitive impairment. Reading that document felt like taking a breath after being underwater too long. Proof. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be twisted or rewritten. Next came the statements from people who knew me well. My neighbours wrote about seeing me on my daily walks and chatting about the weather, the garden, or the news. A woman from the community centre mentioned how I always remembered the dates of events and brought the right supplies to our group meetings. Even the pharmacist wrote a short note saying I managed my own prescriptions without any issues. Every letter strengthened my case, piece by piece. My attorney filed an official objection to the guardianship petition. Once the papers were submitted, a hearing date was set. I had a month to prepare. That month moved slowly, heavy with tension. Emma and Daniel kept contacting me, acting as though nothing unusual had happened, pretending their sudden concern was normal. I felt myself withdrawing from them, putting distance between our conversations, responding with polite but guarded words. The trust I once had in them was gone, replaced by a quiet ache I carried through each day. I didn't tell them about the evaluation, the letters, or the attorney. Let them walk into that courtroom believing I was unprepared. Let them underestimate me the way they had been doing for months. The night before the hearing, I could hardly sleep. I paced around my living room, running my fingers along furniture edges, picture frames, and bookshelves. Everything around me held memories, holidays, milestones, ordinary afternoons. And I realized how much I loved this home, not because of its walls, but because of the life it represented. Losing control of it would mean losing the last piece of myself I had full ownership of. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, cloudy sky. I wore a simple navy dress, brushed my hair neatly, and carried myself as steadily as I could. When I walked into the courthouse, I saw Emma and Daniel sitting together. For a moment, a wave of grief washed over me. They looked like my children again, grown versions of the little faces I once wiped tears from, fed dinners too, tucked into bed. But that softer feeling was quickly replaced by something firmer. They had made their choices. Now I had to make mine. The hearing room was quiet and formal, with harsh lighting that emphasized every expression. The judge reviewed the documents, flipping through pages slowly. My attorney presented the cognitive evaluation, the statements from neighbors and community members, and the evidence that I had been managing my life without any signs of decline. When it was time for the judge to ask me questions, I spoke with clarity and calmness I didn't know I still possessed. I explained my routines, my responsibilities, my medical history, and how the situation had unfolded from my perspective. I didn't paint my children as villains. I simply told the truth. I could feel Emma shifting uncomfortably beside Daniel, their earlier confidence slipping away. The judge questioned them next. Their explanations were vague, their concerns exaggerated, their evidence weak. It became clear they had acted prematurely, maybe even selfishly. The petition relied more on assumptions than facts, more on fears than reality. After reviewing everything, the judge ruled in my favor. The guardianship petition was denied entirely. The judge also noted that any future attempts without legitimate evidence would not be tolerated. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting from my chest, like the air in the room had finally cleared. Emma and Daniel avoided eye contact as we left the courtroom. They walked ahead together, whispering to each other, while I moved at my own pace. When I reached the outside steps, I paused to breathe in the cold air. I felt tired, but I also felt whole, more whole than I had in months. In the days that followed, my children reached out with apologies that felt incomplete, more focused on how the situation had affected them rather than on what they had put me through. I kept my distance. I wasn't unkind, but I wasn't quick to accept their words either. Trust, once damaged, doesn't return easily, and I wasn't in a hurry to rebuild what they had broken. I changed the locks on my doors. I arranged my medical and financial records more securely. I created a clear, updated plan for my future, one that couldn't be twisted or used against me. And I promised myself something important. I would never again ignore my instincts in the name of keeping the peace. My life went back to its quiet rhythm, the one I had cherished before all of this began. I tended my garden, read my books, and enjoyed the simple, peaceful days I had feared losing. But something inside me had changed. I had learned that independence is not just about living alone or managing your bills. It's about defending your right to choose your own path, even when those closest to you try to take that choice away. Growing older doesn't mean giving up control. It doesn't mean handing over the keys to someone else simply because they think they know better. It means standing firm in who you are, even when others underestimate you. My children may have tried to take my life out of my hands, but I took it back, and that is something I will never let happen again.